Today's essential question, which is number 2 out of 4 total, is how do natural selection and adaptation impact biodiversity? So we'll be focusing on two things today: natural selection and adaptation. Once we understand those things, we will investigate how those two things impact biodiversity. Today's first left hand column is natural selection. First left hand column, natural selection. Darwin believed that organisms could change their appearance, structure, and behaviors through slow changes that occurred over many generations. What he needed was a mechanism to account for this. Darwin observed that such a process occurred when humans bred animals and plants. He called this method of producing new man made varieties artificial selection and wondered whether a similar process could occur in nature. During the 18th and 19th centuries, many new plant and animal varieties have been bred through a process called selective breeding. Selective breeding involved taking individual plants or animals with desired traits and crossing them. The resulting offspring would be selected for the same desired traits. This would usually take place over a number of generations until a new breed was produced. For example, plants that produce the juiciest berries might be purposefully cross pollinated with another plant that was frost resistant. Farmers understood that the resulting plants could produce juicy berries and also be resistant to low temperatures. Darwin recognized that this process was similar to what happens in nature, but that characteristics were selected by humans rather than by nature. Darwin argued that, for example, different types of sheep found around the world had a common wild ancestor. He also crossed different breeds of pigeon to select for a wide variety of forms. However, he noticed that the young often looked like the wild rock dove that lived on cliffs. He concluded that the rock dove was the common ancestor of the domestic pigeon. This supported his ideas about all organisms being descended through evolution from a common ancestor. Artificial selection provided Darwin with a useful model for how similar changes occurred in nature.
Traditional plant breeding relies on the controlled cross-pollination of related plant varieties to produce hybrid strains that end up with beneficial traits from each parent plant. Traits that plant breeders have sought to incorporate into our food plants have included things such as improved crop yields, increased tolerance to drought and heat, and resistance to harmful pests and diseases. Genetic crossing is typically achieved by collecting pollen grains from the anthers of one plant variety and manually applying them to the stigmas of another selected variety of the same species. This assures that one set of chromosomes from each parent plant will end up in the seeds of the hybrid offspring. When the seeds of the first hybrid generation are fully mature, they are collected and then are planted and raised. As the second generation matures, the hybrid plants are examined to identify those that express the desired traits. The best individuals are selected and are often repeatedly back-crossed with the parent plant to assure that the offspring they produce always exhibit the sought-after trait. With maize hybridization, that has often meant creating varieties that consistently produce large, nutrient-rich kernels. It is important to note that consistency in a hybrid strain is only possible when the sex cells it produces both possess the same beneficial gene, meaning that the plants are homozygous for that trait.
Darwin eventually came up with an explanation as to how this natural process, which he called it natural selection, could occur. His explanation was based upon 4 observations. These are on the screen here, so please take these down. One of the observations was that all parents, regardless of species, can produce many more offspring than are needed to replace them. For example, an oak tree will produce hundreds or thousands of acorns during its lifespan. Each of these acorns has the potential to grow into a new oak tree. If this happened, then why is the surface of Earth not covered in oak trees? The same applies to animals, including people. What stops the populations of all organisms from growing out of control? Another observation was that all organisms must interact with their environment in order to survive. For example, the availability of food, water, and shelter affect the individual's chances of survival. Their ability to avoid predators and disease are also important factors. Conditions in the environment affect an individual's chances of survival, and many are not successful. So, in any population, many individuals do not survive long enough to reproduce. The third observation: with the exception of identical twins, all individuals of a species are different from one another. This is why we can tell people apart. The existence of these differences is called variation. Although sometimes they look the same to us, all individual organisms, even of the same species, are in fact different. Some organisms have features or adaptations that better suit them for survival. And the last observation is that many variations can be inherited. These variations can be structural or behavioral. For example, mice inherit the color of their fur, and some birds inherit the urge to migrate. Together, these four observations could account for how organisms changed over time. From these observations, Darwin realized that most organisms that are born fail to reproduce. Only those that have characteristics that help them to survive the struggle for existence can breed and pass on their characteristics to the next generation. Their offspring that have these characteristics will be better fitted for survival. Although the differences between generations could be small, over enough generations they could build up. The species would become better adapted to its environment, and it could even change into a new species. And he realized this process occurred everywhere in nature and named it natural selection. Now, Darwin knew nothing about genetics or how new traits arise through mutation. Gregor Mendel's work on genetics did not come to light until after his death, and the discovery of DNA, genes, and how mutations occur were decades into the future. Today, scientists are less concerned with the survival of individuals. They think of natural selection in terms of the impact of differential reproductive success on the selection or loss of genes. Here's our second left-hand column. Effects on biodiversity. Effects on biodiversity. But how do natural selection and adaptation impact biodiversity? Remember, natural selection is an evolutionary mechanism that results in differential reproductive success. This is when some individuals of a species leave behind more offspring than others. If this is the result of genetic variation, then these advantageous changes are passed down to future generations. Scientists use the word adaptation to describe the physical and behavioral changes that enable successful reproduction. So, what is the relationship of natural selection to adaptation and to the development of diversity within and among species? Natural selection is most easily understood at the level of the individual. Those individuals that leave behind descendants are favored. In time, the genes of reproductively successful individuals will come to dominate a population's gene pool. This eventually results in evolutionary change at the level of a population or a species. Diversity within a species commonly arises when populations of a species are separated in some way. The genetic composition of these isolated populations may change over time as each separate population experiences different mutations and is exposed to different selective pressures. Eventually, the gene pools of these species become so different that reproductive barriers build up. These barriers could take a variety of forms, including behavioral differences, such as preferences in selecting a mate, to genome incompatibility. At this point, the populations can no longer interbreed and can be considered two different species. As different species compete for limited resources, differential reproduction will result in the populations of each species having traits that are different from each other. It will favor traits that make a species particularly well suited to a niche within an ecosystem, and each species can occupy a niche that is not being contested by another. In this way, natural selection fosters diversity among species. And our last left-hand column for today, types of natural selection. Types of natural selection. Within the process of natural selection, there is a variety as to how traits are selected. Natural selection is probably most often connected with directional selection. In this type of natural selection, a single beneficial phenotype is favored, increasing allelic frequency to shift in the direction, causing allelic frequency to shift in the direction of that phenotype. Since individuals having this trait are more likely to survive and reproduce, the trait's allele frequency increases within the population. Throughout the generations, more and more members of the population will possess that trait. Directional selection is most often seen when there are environmental changes, or when populations move to new areas with different environmental influences. The evolution of a giraffe's neck exemplifies directional selection. As food became scarce, those individuals that could reach higher branches were more likely to survive. The trait for long necks, then, became more prominent. Disruptive or diversifying selection occurs when extreme phenotypes are favored and selected instead of those with average or intermediate phenotypes. Disruptive selection increases diversity in and among species. Darwin's finches are an example of this type of selection. As mid-sized seeds became scarce on the Galapagos Islands, the birds were forced to rely on large or small seeds. Those birds with either unusually large or unusually small beaks were better adapted to that environment. Thus, they survived, reproduced, and passed on these extreme traits. And lastly, the opposite situation is true in stabilizing selection, which reduces diversity in a species. Stabilizing selection describes changes in population genetics in which intermediate forms of a trait are favored. Much like the story of Goldilocks, stabilizing selection favors those traits that are not too much or too little, but just right. The birth weight of babies is one such trait that follows a stabilizing selection pattern.
Although he's usually credited with developing the theory of evolution, it's more accurate to say that Charles Darwin introduced the theory of natural selection, the mechanism for evolution, in 1859. More than 20 years before, Darwin had set sail aboard the HMS Beagle to study the flora and fauna of South America, despite the fact that he was perpetually seasick.
Oh my.
Well into the 5-year study, Darwin reached the Galapagos Islands.
The natural history of this archipelago is very remarkable. It seems to be a little world within itself. The greater number of its inhabitants, both vegetable and animal, being found nowhere else.
Among the animals Darwin found were lots of birds, finches to be precise. He collected 13 varieties, all very much alike except for the size and shape of their beaks.
I came to the conclusion that all the finches were descended from one species.
Over a long period of time, the birds' beaks had changed. Each was adapted to the kind of food available in their local area. Seed eaters' beaks were different from insect eaters' beaks, and so on. From this and other observations, Darwin developed the theory of natural selection. Certain conditions must be met for natural selection to occur.
There must be a population of things that can make copies of themselves. The copying process must be imperfect. And the copying errors must lead to differences in the ability of the offspring to survive and make copies of themselves.
These copying errors may result in the offspring being better suited to their environment. Or perhaps not. But if the changed offspring are better able to survive, then that change will likely endure and spread throughout the population over generations. For example, there is a species of moth, Biston betullaria, but hardly anyone calls them that ranges in color from light to dark. A population of them lived in a birch forest. Light-colored moths blended with the tree bark, but darker ones stood out against the white birch bark. Birds ate more dark moths because they were easier to spot, leaving mostly light-colored moths to reproduce. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, air pollution. The white birch bark turned sooty gray. Now the pale moths were more visible to birds, and the darker ones were camouflaged.
Oh no!
Birds began eating more pale-colored moths.
Wahoo!
In less than 100 years, the population of moths shifted from mostly pale to mostly dark.
In this example, it pays to be different. When natural selection favors a single trait, such as color, it's called directional selection.
Remember the Galapagos finches? During droughts, birds with strong, large, or very long bills were better equipped to survive. Those with average, medium bills were out of luck.
This is an example of disruptive selection. It pays to be a survivor with the right equipment.
But sometimes it pays to be average. The third distinct type of natural selection is called stabilizing selection, and it favors individuals that are the most like everyone else.
Over time, the most common traits are favored, and the extreme ones are reduced or even eliminated.
Today, the scientific evidence for evolution and natural selection underscores the complexity and beauty of biological design.
At this point, you should be able to answer today's essential question. How do natural selection and adaptation impact biodiversity? Please press pause on the video now and write your answer to this essential question in the summary box at the bottom of your notes.